Welcome to the week one lesson, Making Realistic Predictions. So it's no real surprise, but people are bad at planning ahead. They don't really predict how much time things are going to take, and they often make terrible missteps when they're planning. So my favorite example of this is the Sydney Opera House. You've probably seen it before. This is one of the most famous landmarks of Australia. But interestingly is how it was constructed and built. So originally, when they were planning the project, they estimated that it would cost $7 million and take 6 years to build. In reality, it took $102 million and 16 years. So this is a very famous example of where the plan was completely optimistic and it was way more expensive and time-consuming than it actually took. Now, I won't go too much into the details of what happened with the Sydney Opera House, although I do recommend looking it up if you're interested in it. But instead, I want to use it as an example. This applies to buildings, but also to learning. That a lot of times people will make plans that are completely unrealistic, and then they trip and fail. And they'll either learn it at incredible extra expense, or more likely they'll simply fail. They'll simply be unable to learn the thing that they want to learn, and they'll give up. And I don't want that to happen to you. When I want you to make a project, I want you to make a project that you're going to finish. That you'll send me an email later saying, hey, I finished this project, I finally learned this thing I wanted to learn. That you're not going to be thinking to yourself, well, I started doing that for a couple weeks and then I couldn't stick to it. So how do you avoid making these unrealistic plans that you're never actually going to finish? It's simple. Base your predictions on prior experience. So let's say you create a project and you estimate 50 hours of work per week for 8 weeks. So I'm assuming right now when you're listening to this that you've already done that part of the project and you've broken down your schedule into a week-by-week basis and you have a good estimate of your weekly commitment. So your 50 hours of work per week for 8 weeks of studying. Are you going to be successful at that? Well, the simple question is to ask yourself, have I ever done 50 hours per week of studying for 8 weeks in a row? If the answer is no, you've never done that before, you've never studied that much, you might need to rethink. You might need to check your approach. And I'm also including here, generally when we include these hourly estimates, we're assuming that's productive time. So maybe you can think back to a time where you spent 50 hours in the vague activity of studying, but maybe you weren't actually that productive. You were on Facebook, or you were on your cell phone, or you were chatting with friends. You weren't actually doing work. So if you consider only your productive hours, and you've never done this before, then that should make you pause a little bit. That should make you question, is my plan actually realistic? If the answer is yes, you have done this before, then you might have a decent plan. Your plan might be something you can successfully work with. So the one question that I've gotten from people when I worked with them on this lesson in the past is that people feel that this is kind of a self-limiting prophecy, that you can only ever do what you've done in the past. How are you ever going to do anything bigger than that? If you've always been lazy and unproductive, does this just mean you're just doomed to be lazy and unproductive forever? Why am I even getting this course if that's what I'm trying to suggest? Now, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting that because you haven't studied for 50 hours a week for 8 weeks that it's impossible to do the project, but rather it should have a little bell that rings in your mind that says, I'm doing something that's going to be harder than I've ever done before, and I really need to plan for this. That was the same thing that happened when I did the MIT challenge. It was definitely more studying than I'd ever done before, and so I needed to really prepare for it. And so the workaround to this, in my opinion, is to do a pilot week. Do a pilot week with the schedule that you're actually trying out, and that can be a good first approximation test of, are you cut out for this plan that you set up? So if you have a 50-hour per week for 8 weeks, try doing week 1 of that program. If you do week 1 and it's a failure, you're not able to do it, then you need to rethink your plan. But if you do week 1 and it's successful, now maybe you have a better sense of what it's going to be like over the course of 8 weeks. So when you do your pilot week, I recommend subtracting 10% of your productivity for each month in total that your project runs. So if, let's say, you were able to do let's just, to make the math easier, let's say you were doing 100 hours of studying in a week, which is obviously way too much, but 100 hours of studying in a week, and you did that, you have that for, let's say 3 months. Well, then I would recommend subtracting 30% based on that pilot week. So instead of 100 hours, it's 100 hours minus 30 hours, which is 70 hours is what you should be able to sustain. Same thing goes if it was 10 hours, you should be able to put in 7 hours. And this is to accommodate for two things. One is that you're going to get tired, you're going to get more tired, you're going to get more burnt out, you're going to have more difficulty sticking to a 1-week schedule over a longer period of time. But also there's going to be setbacks. There's going to be times you get sick and you just completely lose half a week of progress. There's going to be emergencies that come up in your life. There's going to be personal issues. You need to account for these things when you're making your plan. And longer plans have much more likely that these things are going to happen. So what if you do have the prior experience? So even in this case, even if you do have the prior experience of having done the plan before, it may be an unrealistic prediction. And this is because motivation and other factors might disrupt your plan. You may not have been as motivated to learn this as you were to learn something else in the past. You may have other factors that are happening in your life. For instance, you might have been able to study well when you were in school, but now you have a full-time job and it's not possible. So my opinion is that the best projects work within normal ranges of your productivity. So this is something that this project will be able to get done given the normal productivity that I've had in the past. Extreme situations mean that there's a much higher chance that the project's going to fail, and so that it means that you need to be a lot better prepared for the project than you would for a project that, yeah, I'll be able to get this finished. So here's a big question. What if you don't have any choice about your deadlines or workload? You say, Scott, you know what, this all sounds great, but I'm just in this really difficult program. It's harder than anything I've done before. Yeah, I'm not as productive as I'd like to be, but I got to do it. What am I going to do? So this is common. I think this is something that's going to happen to everyone at least once or twice. It's going to happen to you as you get into progressively more difficult learning situations. But it means that if you don't have the normal prior experience, you need to take extra steps to bulletproof your plan. You need to spend extra time making sure that you've really thought out a lot of the circumstances, a lot of the ways. What are you going to deal with if you get sick? What are you going to do if some personal stuff comes up? What are you going to do if you start getting burnt out? Having this scenario planning, doing this extra layer of planning is not going to mean that this project is now realistic, but it's going to give it the best possible chance it has of working when you actually go forward.